This is London. You will now hear a statement by the Prime Minister.
Hey, so heads up, this is going to be a bit of a precursor to a video about this game, but I promise I will talk about other things at some point. I just didn't want to rewrite this one yet again, to be honest. Also, I'm sick, so sorry about that. Anyway. First-person shooters are weird, and I think it's because of their popularity that we forget quite how weird they are. They are usually alternate history or reality pieces, given how monumental the inaccurate or entirely fictional events occurring in the games tend to be. And they place the player slap bang in the middle of a war, or some special ops peacetime military operation, or even just in hell itself, where we get to live out the horrors of combat or the power fantasy of zombie killing from the safety of our sofa, without having to actually shoot anyone or anything. I think that in some way they were normalized, alongside being standardized by the Call of Duty series, which is fourth in the all-time list of best-selling video game franchises, only sitting behind two titans that have been racking up sales since the 1980s and the gaming branch of the highest-grossing media franchise ever created. There have been other franchises trying to match up to COD's 425 million sales, but the next best-selling FPS series is Halo, with just 81 million, and that really speaks to the limited successes of these pretenders to the throne. But today's video isn't about Call of Duty, because over the last couple of decades there's been, well, not necessarily a rival, given that the games are less frequent and few of them sell so well, but a Pro Evolution Soccer to Call of Duty's FIFA, a Sonic to its Mario, and Battlefield is fucking wild. So whilst Call of Duty releases a big title every year like clockwork, managing to force themselves into the embodying texts of the cultural zeitgeist almost each time, Battlefield is a different kettle of fish. Known for the enormous, explosive multiplayer environments that result in a more freeing and chaotic replication of warfare, the Battlefield series tends to throw out a major entry every 1 to 3 years, and the campaign might be good or might be bad, or it might not even exist. And the multiplayer is always going to be batshit insane, but could be set over 100 years ago or in the distant future, really just depending on what they fancy doing that time around. Oh, and one time there wasn't even a battlefield, but we'll get to that. Yeah, perhaps there is a method to the madness, or at least a pattern, because whether it's in the technological marvel of the Cold War of the 22nd century or the real-life historical battles that are represented in certain games, I've never felt that the series entirely forgot its identity, which is something that I can't say for some of the other popular first-person shooter franchises. So what is that identity? Well, to find that out, we're going to have to go back to the year 2002, and more specifically, to a month when Atomic Kitten topped the UK singles charts, and the highest grossing movie on the market was My Big Fat Greek Wedding. It was a strange time. It was September, and developers DICE had just released Battlefield 1942. This section's gonna be just fucking long, by the way. 1942 is, of course, set during the Second World War, and, simply put, quickly became one of the best-selling shooters of the early 2000s, shipping 3 million copies by July 2004 as players grew to love the 64-player arena, the modding community that would go on to influence future titles, and the more nuanced approaches enabled, and thus demanded, such as the nature of multiplayer games, by the conquest mode and the reduced focus upon simply killing. The entry won plaudits for its ever-evolving gameplay, which was bolstered with new maps and modes as expansion packs were made available in the years following the game's release, and won Swedish Game of the Decade in 2010, having previously been declared to be the best game of 2002 by GameSpot, PC Gamer, and Computer Gamer magazine. And also the DICE Awards, but that last one feels a bit like the Bluths awarding themselves Best Family at their own awards ceremony in Arrested Development. Regardless, it was clear that the game would become a classic of the early 2000s, but in order to cement itself as a hit franchise, rather than just a much-loved one-off that would fade into the inaccessibility of what would now be considered the ancient technology of 2002, Battlefield 1942 needed a sequel, and it needed to capture the minds of the gaming community as its predecessor had. It couldn't be the same or nobody would bother buying it, but it still needed the familiarity of an iconic, much mythologized historical warfront. And where better to turn than Vietnam? 2004's Battlefield Vietnam took the fight to the swinging 60s, and as such was outfitted with updated weapons, music, and gameplay. In order to replicate the dynamic of the Vietnam conflict, the game featured asymmetrical warfare, where the American forces could significantly outgun their enemies and were able to work with more dangerous vehicles, whilst the North Vietnamese would have to overcome this disadvantage through tactical nous and the terrain advantages offered to them. Numerous features were added, including the ability to shoot from the passenger seats of vehicles, which meant that the vehicular combat that the series is known for was actually worth partaking in as a passenger, facilitating a more mobile and decision-based approach to moving around the map, and turning a feature that had been underutilized into an advantage for the teamwork and movement-based Battlefield philosophy. Overall, the game was seen as a success, and after 8 months it had sold 1 million copies. Battlefield was well and truly in motion, and it was only about to get bigger and better as the franchise made its way into present-day fighting. Battlefield 2, the third game in the series, came out 6 years and 8 games before Battlefield 3, and a further 5 years and 3 games before Battlefield 1.
Right.
As I've mentioned, it's set in the 21st century, and as such the US are at war with a vaguely Middle Eastern enemy, and China. The game again focused on how they could improve teamwork, allowing 32 random strangers on the internet to function as a cohesive unit rather than betraying their status as just some individuals haphazardly thrown together. The vehicles were designed to operate on a rock-paper-scissors dynamic, meaning that no one enemy would become unbeatable through their choice of transport, and that a player vulnerable to an enemy's vehicle was relying upon their teammates to use another vehicle to counter it, forcing them to operate in a manner that benefits the team rather than just themselves, as team play was in fact the best way to thrive as an individual. There was also the notable inclusion of squads within each team, groups of up to 6 members able to communicate with one another using real-time voice chat, led by a squad leader who could set objectives and act as a mobile spawn point, as well as communicating directly with the commander overseeing the battle. All this in mind, Battlefield 2 might be the most important game in the series with regards to enhancing its identity, moving the games into the era where many of them take place, featuring real, modern weapons and military technologies, and of course, emphasizing teamwork in a multiplayer that introduced many of the key features that persist to this day. It feels like a realization of the ethos that every interesting element of large-scale warfare should be playable and enjoyable, creating a Battlefield like no other with so many moving parts and limitless combinations and possibilities. And therefore it's not that surprising to me that this remains the highest rated game in the franchise, critically speaking. But the next title, released just 4 months later, took it a step further by introducing a single-player campaign. Of sorts. Battlefield 2 Modern Combat, released 2 whole years before this incredibly unoriginal title, was the first Battlefield game available on consoles. It had a pretty basic story that revolved around NATO and China being conned into going to war with one another, and offered players the ability to pick sides in the conflict. That's about it for the campaign. It was not all that groundbreaking. The multiplayer, which was limited to just 24 players rather than the usual 64, did of course feature conquest, but also capture the flag and the option to form a clan to attain some additional abilities. It was a good game. It was
Pretty good. It was alright. It wasn't great, but it was fine.
moving on. And moving on indeed, because the next Battlefield game was like, fuck this, the present is boring. And a full year before Call of Duty had even found its way out of the 1940s, Battlefield was drunkenly stumbling 136 years into the future, predicting a war between the EU and an entity known as the Pan-Asian Coalition as they fight for the last remnants of unfrozen land during a new ice age. Which is perhaps a little optimistic, if anything. Also, this conflict is known as the Cold War of the 22nd century, despite the fighting, because of the whole icy hellscape of a setting. That's not what a Cold War is, but at least they got the right century. Anyway, the game introduced 2 key features, one of which would stick around as an essential part of the Battlefield experience, and one of which is primarily remembered for briefly slightly returning in 2013's Battlefield 4. The first of those is the customizable classes, allowing players to attain the most benefit from each kit through unlocking new technologies and designing their own playstyle and perks to best support their game, as well as to steal an enemy's dog tags through meleeing them. The second of those features was Titan mode, which basically required each team to destroy a giant enemy vehicle. But like, in the future. There were also some bugs that weren't patched until months after its release, which some found frustrating, but those people need to learn that this is actually a design feature. You see, Battlefield 2 was buggy for months, and that is the best reviewed Battlefield game to date, so 2142 was clearly an attempt to capture some of the magic of that entry. It wasn't a complete success, but the futuristic game was still praised for its innovations and generally well reviewed by critics. So, having released 3 games and a further 4 expansion packs in 16 months, DICE capped off 2142 with the Northern Strike Booster Pack, which provided new game modes, maps, vehicles, and unlocks. And this apparently took the fight out of them, because there wasn't another Battlefield game or expansion for 15 months and 15 days, which is a record that stood until the gap between the summer update of June 2020 and the November 2021 release of Battlefield 2042. There were far too many numbers in that sentence. Bad Company, built for consoles, full single-player campaign, huge destructible environments, great game. It also featured an early edition of Rush, which would become a mainstay in the series, and in which one team is sent to destroy certain items being defended by the other side, within a set number of lives. They initially didn't include Conquest in the game, and this made some people really mad. So it was reinstated, but as an act of rebellion, DICE released Battlefield games Heroes and 1943 in 2009, and both were weird. For starters, each only had 3 classes, which felt like a bit of a regression after the previous 2 games had offered a larger number of more customizable classes, but then neither of these were considered major releases, so I guess that's a thing. Heroes is awkward and clumsy and in third person, but this is apparently so that people could play it on their shit laptops. And unless I'm mistaken, the game doesn't have much of a lasting legacy, meaning that I can't be too up in arms about any of the creative decisions made. And as for 1943, it's decent, but also just an arcade game, literally sold on Xbox Live Arcade, and didn't add all that much to the series. Not that it could be expected to. The total cost of Heroes and 1943 combined was less than $15, even at the time of release. Maybe I'm just... I think I'm just confused and frustrated because I don't have anything to say, which is a fucking thirst, so enjoy it while it lasts, folks. Which is until now, because we're moving on, and as we do, we see a huge improvement in the franchise's visuals and playability. And whilst this is largely speculation, it makes sense to me that this would be because of the success of Call of Duty at this time. That series had exploded in popularity since 2007's Modern Warfare, which was followed up with World at War, Modern Warfare 2, and Black Ops, each a legendary game in its own right. And in that time, Battlefield had dropped one good but graphically and ergonomically outdated title with 2 sort of games that didn't quite offer the same all-action experience. Furthermore, the releases of both Bad Company 2 and Battlefield 3, the next 2 major entries in the series, were preceded by direct comparisons from DICE to the Call of Duty series, effectively using that franchise's noted quality and popularity to establish a benchmark for the Battlefield titles, which demonstrates the mindset at the time. But I didn't know any of this when I first played Bad Company 2, immediately following my time with the first Bad Company game, so I was shocked at how far the spin-off series had come in the 2 years since the prior release. As you can see, there's a clear jump in the visuals, and it has to be said that the destructible environments felt a lot more honed than in previous games, with the controls also being far more intuitive for modern players. The title also introduced regenerating health in a manner more akin to the logic that the newer games followed, and if I'm getting this right, was the first to feature both Squad Rush and Squad Deathmatch, which placed that little bit of extra emphasis on the teamwork elements of Battlefield, with each player now making up a huge part of their team and therefore having more responsibility to work more effectively as a member of the squad in order to succeed. Something that is also thematically relevant throughout the single-player campaign, in which we return to Bad Company, a unit who now know and understand one another to a greater degree. And then comes Battlefield 3. Battlefield 3 was a huge turning point for the series as a whole, and yet perhaps should have done more. You see, the game was a clear manifestation of the desire to step things up in line with the opposition of the late noughties and early 2010s. The online multiplayer featured a number of classic maps that are still active 11 years later. And once again, the visuals and the gritty stylization really solidified the suitability of the series for a new decade. 3 is also the first main entry in the series to have a single-player campaign, which is weirdly recognised by the Guinness Book of World Records, even though they falsely claimed that every game prior to 3 was a solely multiplayer experience. And also I don't know why they're only focusing on the major entries, but let's not get into that. Considering it had been 2 years since they were throwing out arcade games that looked like they belonged in the GoldenEye era, Bad Company 2 and Battlefield 3 were certainly statements of intent, but they still failed to take advantage of perhaps the biggest gift on offer. 2 weeks after the release of Battlefield 3, Call of Duty dropped Modern Warfare 3, which, although it sold tens of millions and was critically acclaimed, was despised by a lot of that series' die-hard fans, and is seen by many as the point at which the games began their now infamous decline. Many, including myself, turned to other shooters as the series that had served 10-year-old boys so well seemed to fall into the mud. But whilst Battlefield seemed like the prime place for fans to go, an ambitious franchise that was releasing quality games at a rate that most others couldn't keep up with, DICE were like, nah. Sure, I don't believe that Modern Warfare 3 was quite as bad as a lot of people said, and it certainly wasn't as bad as the series was going to get. Nonetheless, Battlefield had an opportunity to step into the limelight as the FPS of the 2010s, but just didn't. The games became less frequent, with the next Battlefield 4 releasing over 2 years later at the end of 2013. The next game after that was Hardline in 2015, and that wasn't even about a battlefield. And then the biggest and, in my opinion, best release, First World War title Battlefield 1, was unfortunate enough to come out 18 months later in late 2016, shortly after the much adored Doom 2016 and the 8th best-selling game of all time, Overwatch. Not to mention the enduring popularity of 2012's Counter-Strike Global Offensive, which has been in the Steam charts for 536 weeks and remains the most played game on the platform to this day. 1.1 million people were playing it at the same time earlier today. Anyway, all that meant is that despite these being great games who would still have enough dedicated fans to find you 63 other players without much problem, there wasn't the same excitement around every release as there should have been. And 2 years after the still stellar Battlefield 1, well, Battlefield V. Actually, I've heard some people call this one Battlefield 5, but they are wrong. These games have never used Roman numerals before, and they're hardly likely to start now. So Battlefield V features a woman fighting in World War II, and this made some people really, really mad. So mad, in certain cases, that this is going in the history section of the video. They were historically mad. Luckily, this didn't have as much of an impact upon the course of history as the women who actually fought in the Second World War, and the game itself was still pretty great by my books. So we should really move on to Battlefield 2042. Now, this game is not great, to put it mildly. They've jumped into the future yet again and made a bunch of mistakes that I'll get into in a bit, but this game understandably made everybody really, really mad. The title that promised exhilarating 128 player matches was primarily defined by the removal of classes, a complete lack of content, and an extremely buggy release, with the most positive response to these core elements of the game coming from people who just don't particularly care. This latest Battlefield has somewhat soured the reputation of the series, and there's a fear amongst a few that it might be starting its own decline. And that's why we're here today, finally announcing my mission statement, to take a look at what it is that the next major entry needs to do to salvage the series and, with any luck, push it to higher heights and a new generation of fans. What's important to note is that there have been great Battlefield games, and the series has a core identity that hasn't really changed all that much since it first emerged in 2002. So there are guidelines for what makes a great Battlefield game, and what needs to be built upon in the next one. And I think the first thing to note is the collection of core elements at the heart of the Battlefield series. A great Battlefield game needs to have an emphasis on vehicular warfare, interesting and well-balanced game modes that each offer something new so that every player can find their expertise or experience the variety of numerous types of warfare, huge maps that still manage to have intricate design despite their grand scale, utter mayhem that can nonetheless be affected and even harnessed by skillful individuals, and a wide range of activities and elements of combat that each player can partake in. That is what Battlefield means, and what its players are therefore hoping for from their ventures into the world of warfare and tanks and helicopters and explosions. There are so many first-person shooters out there that have good gunplay and decent level design, so it's important for a great shooter to do something special to stand out. What Battlefield has in that regard is a strong foundation to build from, a unique formula that gives the games a platform from which they can strive for new heights and the opportunity to redefine players' experiences and expectations of the genre, as they arguably did with titles such as Battlefield 2, which injected teamwork and tactics into the series in a manner that can still be felt in many military games to this day. I think that classes are also essential, which someone really should have reiterated before the development of 2042, because they offer a wider ability to affect each match and find success as more than just a killing machine. Playing Battlefield 3 as an 11-year-old who'd never owned an FPS to myself before, I was not good at the whole not dying thing, but found myself topping leaderboards through focusing on healing and reviving teammates and charging between waypoints to capture flags for the team. Similarly, you can concentrate on resupplying teammates, fixing up allied tanks, and destroying enemy vehicles, tipping the wider battle in your team's favour as the enemy are reduced to an infantry-only assault. Or you can sit on the edge of the map with a sniper rifle, refusing to help the team whatsoever, if you're a cunt. It's also beneficial for Battlefield games to exploit the technological developments that we've seen undergone in recent years. One of the best examples of this from the franchise is the expansion of destructible environments, which have been a particularly strong feature since the Bad Company games really demonstrated what an advantage a dynamic, shifting environment could be. Whether through moving through different areas across the course of a longer campaign such as in Battlefield 1's Operations, destroying buildings and changing the terrain through destructive means, the so-called levolution that allows players to affect the nature of the levels in a more considered manner than simply bombing the shit out of them, or some combination of all three. The cutting-edge nature of the series has also been emphasised by the top-quality visuals of certain entries, which is perhaps best demonstrated by Bad Company 2's graphics being lauded as a key factor in that game's much more impressive and immersive atmosphere over its predecessor, which many criticise for looking like it was rendered by a toaster. And also, it's great to see Battlefield making the most of recent hardware developments, because although 2042's 128-player games are poorly managed and demonstrate the need for a little more direction in those uber unfathomable situations, console players have long been living without the option to dive into the authentic 64-player Battlefield experience, and it's awesome to see that all players alike can now jump into online games that really showcase the series' greatest strengths. Now, I couldn't say what the next characteristics of game-changing technology will or would be, but these are elements that have seen the games evolve into something even better, and I believe that sticking to a philosophy of utilising the budget and high hardware demands of each title to expand into previously untrodden areas of FPS gaming will allow the series to continue to impress in the future. Now, in terms of the single-player campaign, it hasn't historically been a huge part of the series. Nonetheless, titles such as Bad Company and Battlefield 3 really brought it into the fold, allowing players the option to become acquainted with the controls, playstyles, and gameplay before jumping right into the unforgiving multiplayer setting, as well as to experience the additional elements of entertaining characters, precisely manufactured storylines, plausible action, and a strictly controlled tone, each of which is simply unavailable in Conquest or Rush or whatever. Therefore, I'd argue that it's become a valuable part of each title and should really be focused upon, or at least exist, in any future title that purports to be an entire game, especially as it's not really restricted by anything other than the fans' desire for it to be half decent, and offers a space for creative expression that doesn't have to have the same entrenched characteristics as the long-loved multiplayer. In Hardline and V, stealth became a key component, whereas there's a clear divergence in tone between the comedic stylings of Bad Company and the bleak and mournful atmosphere of Battlefield 1. As long as it's consistent within the game itself, the mood of the single player, and in fact the campaign as a whole, is an area where narrative designers can really express themselves and create something beloved by fans of the series. Take for instance 2016's Battlefield 1, which opens with a moving interactive montage that, for me, had an impact upon the entire game, even as I play it 6 years later, by highlighting the immense human cost of a war that, unlike certain others in the series, genuinely occurred and had a real devastating impact that the world still feels to this day. And I believe that the emotional weight is reinforced by the increased accuracy that the game boasts over other shooters. You can tell that they really went out of their way to uncover as much classic weaponry as possible, and made it feel real by including clunky reloading and technologies or problems that are often bypassed as a means of streamlining the experience of many historical shooters. Adding to that the historical context provided by the introductory remarks and conclusions of the commentator, as well as the sentiments expressed from the perspectives of soldiers in the build-up to each operation, helping to infuse the dread of the battle as you come to realise that you are simply a small part of the wider carnage and won't make make it through to the other side, and the real-life facts and statistics that are brought up in cutscenes and loading screens regarding the cost of the war, and what you have is a game that focuses on rebuilding the environment of the First World War to allow us to feel some semblance of the horror that it represented to millions of young men in particular, which is especially relevant given the fact that that's likely the core demographic of Battlefield players. Multiplayer wargames, particularly first-person shooters and particularly historical ones, always sensationalize war. But Battlefield 1 is perhaps the closest that it's possible to come to doing so with what at least seems like a genuinely mournful message. Which, as I'm writing this sentence the day after Remembrance Day, feels like a huge achievement in an industry built around glorifying the circumstances that led to the deaths of so many. So yeah, that was good. And I think it's because of this that some people were disappointed by the historical inaccuracies in this game, which were definitely present, perhaps most notably in the Norwegian set mission, which turns heroic operations designed to reduce casualties into a one-woman rampage that basically wins the Second World War. That said, I do think that this was less of a problem than some made out. The game's executive producer wrote on Twitter that they are more interested in fun than historical accuracy, and the fact that the short single-player stories highlight such historical issues and factors as press gangs, conscripted children, tirailleurs, and the Nazis' production of heavy water in an attempt to harness nuclear power made me feel that there was at least some historical value to the game. What was decried as a robot arm was actually a split-hip prosthetic, an invention apparently patented by a guy named David W. Dorrance in 1912, and which you can see in use in the 1940s in a number of videos from the time. Also, I genuinely don't even remember if this woman appeared in the game. Does she? What? I'm not trying to discredit how people felt about the game, but I do find it confusing that there was such vitriol surrounding this particular part of this particular Battlefield, when I thought that there are actually quite a few positives in that area. And finally, perhaps the most important aspect of any Battlefield game, you need a BOP. And all that together is the recipe for a great Battlefield game. But it leaves a question: how do you take it to the next level? And the answer might well be in eradicating the mistakes made by previous titles. Now, as much as I love most of these games, they've certainly had their issues, some of which have persisted throughout the majority of the series in, frankly, quite a worrying fashion. Chief among those problems is the persistence of buggy launches and performance issues that are at best a little distracting, which can be the difference between life and death in online multiplayer, and at worst capable of rendering entire game modes unplayable. This has been the case for every single game in the main series, and a number of other major entries have also suffered. Perhaps most notably, DICE promised players that they would not release any additional content for Battlefield 4 until the notoriously buggy game was fixed, and then just did the opposite of that, leaving many discontented not only through failing to deliver on the promises made by the new game, but also going out of their way to effectively lie to players about the fact that the game wasn't going to be fixed in the foreseeable future, instead having even basic functionality kicked aimlessly down the road and into the uncertainty of maybe later, where seemingly solid ideas like Hannibal Season 4 are left to rot until they're untenable. I think that this extra misstep is indicative of the fact that fixing these issues is not a priority for DICE in the way that it should be, especially given the frankly broken nightmare that was many players' experience of Battlefield 2042. And I can only hope that the overwhelmingly negative fan response to that game will have them taking a serious look at how to improve upon this in the future. Way back in 2005, the Gaming Nexus review of Battlefield 2 really summarised the existence of bugs in the Battlefield series by stating that there are many cool experiences playing it and a lot of did I just see that moments, but all of that is crapped on by the bugs and quirks in the game, which concisely demonstrates what a problem these performance issues can be, and how fixing them could really fortify the franchise's reputation and allow players to explore the stellar games as they are meant to be played and enjoyed. A similarly common issue, though less of an obstacle to actually playing the games, is the fact that many of the campaigns and other single-player alternatives fail to offer as much of an incentive to purchase or return to the game as the multiplayer does. Between the poor AI that has plagued the series for over a decade and the lack of solo content for games like Hardline and 2042, it's easy to see why the single-player modes are often taking a backseat to the 64+ player mayhem. A good campaign needs some basic elements such as decent characters, story, and gameplay evolution, and some sort of narrative drive that preferably would stand out against the litany of other first-person shooters with half-baked solo campaigns where you're for some reason fighting Russians and terrorists in some fictional country in the Middle East. Very original. Much like with Battlefield's core identity features, failing to deliver a serviceable story can lose you a lot of points in the reviews and audience feeling towards your game, which is why it's imperative for any truly great future entry in the series to deliver on this front, and why it seems so strange that Battlefield, a franchise capable of guaranteeing fantastic experiences that no other set of games can provide, also consistently fails at some of the most basic elements of making a good game. And this is true of certain strong sequel elements too. Several of the games have been criticised for the inadequacy of their intended improvements over previous titles. Having such a strong multiplayer formula and identity has really strengthened the series as a whole, but also means that some games can feel like they haven't really progressed at all from the prior entries. Take Battlefield 4, which was criticised for looking and feeling a little too much like Battlefield 3, and then Battlefield Hardline, with its multiplayer that was criticised for looking and feeling a little too much like Battlefield 4, despite the hugely different setting and premise. Then ask yourself, do I really want to pay $180 odd for these three very similar games at release when they dropped a free-to-play game 2 years earlier, and when you could pick up 3, a game that still has active players to this day, for cheap a couple of years after it came out? Considering this alongside the fact that you've chopped and changed the game modes on a few occasions, meaning that your favourite might not even be in the next one, and you have to ask yourself why you'd keep up with the series at all. I mean, I'm a huge fan of these games, and I currently play them more than anything else by a long way, but I haven't paid a penny towards one in years. I've enjoyed each of these titles for free, admittedly aided by getting 1 and 3 as Christmas presents, but the point still stands. So I can't blame anyone who doesn't want to burn AAA prices plus DLC costs every couple of years for a game that you might get a lot less from than the one that you already own. If they offered enough that was new each time, then I get it, but a fair few of them simply don't. And DICE's poor sequel planning is perhaps typified by the latest game, which, despite not having a story, still makes the move of canonising those extreme weather events that supposedly devastate the Earth between 2024 and, of course, 2042, which brings about questions for the future. In 2 years' time, they won't be able to make a game set in the then present day that ignores the devastation wrought upon the United States by the most powerful hurricane ever recorded. Unless they retcon everything, which would just be the sickly icing on the rotting cherry of the shit cake of this entire game. In 6 years' time, Europe is supposed to be engulfed in apocalyptic flames that would wreak havoc upon humanity. An eighth of the global population is apparently going to be stateless in just 2 decades. And whilst there's every chance that they get lucky, well, maybe not lucky, but correct, they've written these types of events into the lore of the Battlefield universe, meaning that in future entries they are either bound to the consequences that these events have upon the world, causing an irreversible divergence from our own that might make it difficult for new players to jump right in, or set to ignore the game entirely, which might be easier done than said due to the complete lack of a campaign, but equally would be a humiliation and would likely tick a lot of people off.
Yes!
When they made Battlefield 2142, the series was still in its chaotic mid-2000s infancy, where the entries were less popular and a lot less accountable, and the events of the game are mostly far enough into the future that there's no need to worry about them. The series won't be around in 120 years, and the events of, for instance, Battlefield 1, many of which take place almost 230 years prior, aren't going to clash with the far future canon established in 2006. However, 2042, which is predicated upon the world-changing moments that are supposed to happen during the next Premier League season, doesn't have that buffer. They'd done a bit of a Far Cry 5 when, spoilers, a huge nuclear war devastated the world of the game and left them with such a conundrum that they broke with Far Cry tradition, went insane, and produced a proper sequel which they immediately regretted, returning to the classic Far Cry blueprint in last year's Far Cry 6. Be interesting to see if there's a similar meltdown post-Battlefield 2042 actually. Also, on the topic of the newest game's missing campaign, it does again have to be acknowledged that they were never the greatest part of the best entries of the franchise, but they still offer players a chance to hone their abilities, grow accustomed to the world and story, and enjoy low-intensity fun that could be paused, quit, come back to, and replayed at any time. You could experience new theatres that were never introduced to the online game, and could come to understand the title's ethos and characters and conflicts, but the lack of any single player experience at all makes Battlefield 2042 feel vapid and soulless and more of an expansion pack than a real game. Compare that to the effect that, for instance, even the musical cues of Battlefield 1 when you die in the online multiplayer have, harking back to the introductory sequence that has such an effect on so many. It's just, why would you not do this? Oh, and last piece of advice for anyone who might be making another game, which revolves around the fact that the games set in the year X42, that is 1942, 2142, and now 2042, have been a bit of a mixed bag, so clearly that's not a theme that needs to be continued. Sorry for those of you who were hoping for Battlefield 1742 to crop up next. So I'm pretty tired of this video by now. Hopefully you're not, although maybe there's no more of it, so maybe. But the basic conclusion is that there's a lot that the next Battlefield game needs to do, and they weren't even slightly close to most of that with the latest title. So unfortunately, I'm not holding out too much hope. However, we do learn from our mistakes, and by that metric, DICE might be the brainiest bunch on the planet right now. There are positives to take from some promising signs, such as the fact that there is a proper single-player campaign planned for the next game, with Studio Ridgeline Games created with the explicit intention of developing the single-player Battlefield experience from here on out, and helmed by Halo co-creator and art director Marcus Leto. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing that name, I do not know how it's said. And if they can return to providing the classic Battlefield experience, whilst remembering to include and build upon the range of interesting and dynamic combat environments, the cutting-edge technological marvels that can cause the series to stand out, the positive elements that certain single-player campaigns have contained, and also to amend the issues with bugs and load times, and the lack of content and progression between games, there might just be another great Battlefield game on the horizon. And maybe I'll actually buy it this time if there is. Thanks for watching. If you made it this far through this complete mess of a video, then you absolutely deserve some kind of gold star, so congratulations for earning one of those, I suppose. Have you played any of the Battlefield games? What did you think of those Battlefield games? Do you have any other thoughts on the Battlefield games or this Battlefield video? Are you tired of the word Battlefield? I know I am, so I'm going to stop saying it now, and instead start saying thanks again, and that I hope to see you next time.